The wildfire jumped the ridge 2 miles faster than anyone at Cedar Hollow campground had planned for, and within 20 minutes, 300 bikers were about to be trapped between a single-lane dirt road and a wall of flame closing from 2 directions at once. The camp's own safety coordinator was still arguing the rally shouldn't be cancelled, when a woman nobody there had ever seen raise her voice started giving evacuation orders that actually made sense. Smoke had already turned the morning sky the color of a bruise by the time the camp medic smelled it clearly enough to stop what she was doing. She was restocking the first aid tent's burn kit routine, the kind of thing a volunteer camp medic did between minor scrapes and dehydration cases, when the wind shifted hard enough to carry actual ash instead of just haze. She had volunteered as camp medic for the Iron Legion's rally for 2 years running now. A quiet arrangement that suited her. A weekend of minor injuries and heat exhaustion in exchange for a campsite. And a community that never asked too many questions about who she'd been before she showed up with a first aid certification and not much else in the way of explanation. Nobody here knew she'd once run search and rescue training courses for outdoor guides and park rangers across 3 states. She preferred it that way, and had for 6 years. She stepped outside and looked at the ridgeline a mile north, where a gray-brown column had gone from a smudge to a wall, in the time it took her to blink twice. Wind gusts that had been mild all morning were suddenly strong enough to bend the tree line, carrying the smell of scorched dry brush a full mile ahead of the flames themselves. The specific signature of fire moving through drought-stressed fuel, with wind pushing hard behind it. Around her, the campground carried on in ordinary rhythm, someone frying bacon over a portable stove, 2 bikers arguing good-naturedly about carburetor settings, a kid chasing a dog between rows of parked motorcycles. None of them yet looking at the sky the way she now was. "That's not a controlled burn," she said, to nobody, already moving toward the coordinator's tent. Pete Sorensen, running event logistics for the Iron Legion's annual Veterans Rally, had a radio in one hand and a schedule board in the other. Forest Service says contain and monitor. We're not canceling day 2 over smoke on a ridge 2 miles out. That fire's moving with the wind, not against it, and the wind just picked up. 2 miles closes fast under these conditions, she said. You need to start moving people toward the exit road now. Not after the Forest Service tells you to. I've got 300 people who paid for a 4-day rally, Sorensen said, not looking up from his board. I'm not triggering a panic evacuation because a volunteer medic doesn't like the color of the sky. Naomi, she said, her voice dropping cold, and it's not the color I'm worried about. It's the speed. I asked you last month to run an evacuation drill for exactly this scenario. You said there wasn't budget for it this season. A younger volunteer nearby, overhearing, glanced between them, uncomfortable being caught between 2 adults arguing about something she had no standing to weigh in on. I'm not asking you to evacuate, Naomi said. I'm asking you to start staging vehicles now, quietly, so that if this does close the way I think it will, you're not doing it in a panic later. That costs you nothing if I'm wrong. Sorensen finally looked up, weighing the request against the schedule in his hand. I'll think about it. Naomi didn't argue further. She'd learned, a long time ago, exactly how much good arguing did with someone who'd already decided the danger wasn't real yet. She went to find the exit road instead, and confirmed what she already suspected. It was single-lane dirt for the first mile. The only way in or out of a campground tucked into a narrow valley that the fire, if it kept moving the way it was moving, would reach from 2 sides within the hour. She stood at the mouth of that road for a long moment, watching the smoke column continue to thicken against the ridgeline, running calculations in her head that she hadn't consciously practiced in 6 years, but that surfaced anyway. Fully formed, the way a language never fully forgets itself even after long silence. Wind speed, fuel load in the surrounding brush, time to closure if the current rate held. 15 minutes, she decided. Maybe 20 if she was being generous. She turned back toward camp already knowing Sorensen's 20 minutes of thinking about it was more time than they actually had. The fire crossed the ridge at 10:40 a.m. faster than any Forest Service estimate had accounted for, and Cedar Hollow went from a campground to a trap in less time than it took most of the 300 people there to finish breaking down their tents. "It's coming down both sides of the valley," Naomi said, finding Sorensen again. Radio traffic now crackling with actual fire command chatter instead of routine event logistics. "The exit road's still clear, but it won't be in 20 minutes if the wind holds. Forest Service is sending trucks. Forest Service is 15 minutes out on a road that might not exist by the time they get here," Naomi said. "I need you to get on that PA system and start organized evacuation right now. Vehicles first, out the single-lane road, staged so nobody bottlenecks it." Something in her voice finally landed, flat. Immediate, the register of someone who'd said sentences like this before. And been right often enough to trust the shape of her own certainty. Sorensen grabbed the PA handset. "This is not a drill." His voice crackled out over the campground, unsteady on the first few words before finding a rhythm. "Fire is approaching from the north. All vehicles proceed to the exit road in an orderly fashion. Leave gear if you have to. Do not leave people." The evacuation that followed wasn't clean. 300 people trying to break camp and load motorcycles onto a single dirt road, under smoke thick enough to sting eyes and throats, produced exactly the kind of controlled chaos any wildfire evacuation produces. Horns, shouting, someone's dog running loose between idling engines, a toddler crying somewhere in the haze. Sorensen, radio still in hand, fell into step beside Naomi as she started directing traffic near the road's mouth. "What do you need from me right now? Keep people calm on the PA. Repeat the instructions every 2 minutes. Same words, same tone. Panic spreads faster than smoke does if you let your own voice show it." Naomi didn't look at him as she said it, already waving the next vehicle forward. "And find someone with a working radio to relay to the Forest Service that we're self-evacuating. Don't wait for their trucks to tell us it's necessary." Sorensen didn't argue this time. He simply did what she'd said, voice steadying over the PA system with each repetition. Exactly the way she'd asked. Bikes that had been lined up in neat show formation rows an hour earlier were now being wheeled and dragged toward the exit road in whatever order people could manage. Engines catching on second and third tries in the thickening smoke. Riders coughing behind bandanas pulled up over their faces. An older Harley stalled directly in the middle of the narrow road, and for one dangerous minute, the entire evacuation backed up behind it while its owner fought with a choked carburetor. "Push it to the shoulder. Don't wait on it," Naomi called out, already moving toward the stalled bike herself. Between her and 2 nearby riders, they headed off the road in under 30 seconds. Engine abandoned. Owner riding double behind a friend instead. The line started moving again almost immediately. An older woman near the food tent had frozen completely, staring at the smoke with the particular paralysis of someone whose body had simply stopped taking instructions from her mind. Naomi crouched in front of her, blocking the view of the fire with her own body. "Look at me, not the smoke," Naomi said. "What's your name?" "C. Carol," the woman managed. "Carol, I need you to walk to that blue truck with me right now." Just walking, nothing harder than that. Naomi kept her voice level, unhurried despite everything happening around them. And Carol's feet finally started moving, one step, and then another, until the truck was close enough to reach. Naomi moved through the rest of it with the same economy she'd once moved through terrain far more dangerous than this. Years ago. In a job she hadn't spoken about out loud in longer than she wanted to count. She sorted vehicles by what could move fastest, held back anyone trying to jump the line in a way that would jam the narrow road, and kept one eye on the fire's advance the entire time, timing its approach against a mental clock nobody around her knew she was running. A man near the back of the line went down hard, clutching his chest, the specific gray pallor of a body deciding this was exactly the wrong moment to have a cardiac event. Naomi reached him in seconds, checking his pulse, calling out to the nearest able-bodied rider for help getting him into the bed of a truck. Chest pain, radiating to his left arm, started about the time the PA announcement went out. she said, working fast. Panic can mimic this. But I'm not betting his life on that being the whole explanation. Get him to the staging area. Tell whoever meets you there it's a possible cardiac event. Not just smoke exposure. The writer didn't argue. He loaded the man into the truck bed himself. And Naomi watched it pull away toward the exit road before turning back to the next problem already forming behind her. 20 minutes into the evacuation, with roughly half the camp already moving down the exit road. The fire did the thing wildland fire almost always does when a valley narrows and superheated air has nowhere else to go, it jumped. Naomi had watched for exactly this. Fire behavior in a valley this shape followed patterns she'd taught for 6 years before she'd stopped teaching anything at all. Heat rising. Funneling. Finding the path of least resistance across the ridge instead of down it the way most untrained observers expected. She'd positioned herself near the camp's western edge specifically because that was where she'd calculated a spot fire was most likely to start. If the main front behaved the way this terrain suggested it would. A spot fire ignited on the far side of the campground, cutting off the last dozen tents from the main evacuation route entirely. Naomi heard the shift in the fire's sound before she saw the flames. A change in pitch. The roar of fire finding new fuel faster than it had been consuming the old. Second front, west side, she shouted, already running toward it. Anyone still back there needs another way out. Now, for 1/2 second. Running toward smoke instead of away from it. Her body remembered exactly how badly this had gone once before. A different valley. A different fire season. A decision that had cost a young man his life because she hadn't been fast enough. Hadn't been loud enough. Hadn't done something she still couldn't fully name 6 years later. She pushed the memory down the way she'd learned to, and kept running anyway. Because there wasn't room for the old grief in the next 4 minutes. Only room for whoever was still trapped behind that new fire line. Here is the next section formatted with dramatic pauses and emphatic caps for a high-energy, cinematic read aloud. A biker named Cole, Preacher, Simmons, one of the club's older members, had gone back for his dog and gotten himself cut off by the new fire line. Smoke thick enough that he could no longer see the direction he'd come from. Naomi found him by sound more than sight, hauling her own shirt up over her nose and mouth as she moved into smoke thick enough to make her eyes stream. Heat pressed against her skin like something physical, close enough now that she could hear individual branches cracking somewhere ahead of her in the dark gray wall. This way, stay low, follow my voice. The air's better near the ground. Can't see a damn thing. Cole coughed out. You don't need to see. You need to follow me. Naomi's voice stayed level. The same flat certainty she'd used on Sorensen an hour earlier. Now doing the work of a lifeline in a wall of smoke. 3 more steps. Now down, under this branch. Keep your hand on my shoulder. The dog in Cole's arms was coughing too. A small, terrified sound that Naomi used as an extra anchor point in the dark. Orienting by ear as much as by memory of the terrain she'd scouted an hour earlier. Not fear. Focus. Her own lungs burned with every breath. Smoke thick enough now to taste, and she kept moving anyway. Because stopping to feel any of it would cost time neither of them had. They came out the other side of the smoke wall into clearer air. Cole's dog still clutched against his chest. Both of them coughing hard, but moving. Naomi caught his wrist for 2 seconds, checking his pulse and the color under his fingernails the way she checked every patient who walked through her doors. Rapid. But strong. Lips still pink. Nothing that couldn't wait. Good enough to move on. She didn't stop to check on them fully. There wasn't time. She was already scanning for the next person who might still be trapped behind the new fire line. 2 more stragglers emerged from the smoke over the next several minutes. Guided out by the same low, steady voice cutting through the haze. Until Naomi was reasonably certain the western pocket of the campground had emptied entirely. She did one final pass along the tree line, calling out into the smoke, waiting a full 10 seconds past the point where waiting any longer would have cost her the ability to get out herself, before finally turning back toward the exit road. Her lungs ached in a way she recognized from a lifetime ago. The specific burn of smoke exposure her body remembered. even after 6 years of never expecting to need that memory again. She checked her own pulse out of habit more than actual concern, counted her breaths back down to something steady, and made her way toward the exit road at a pace that finally allowed itself to feel something like exhaustion. Behind her, the fire had fully consumed the western half of the campground, tents and gear reduced to smoking frames. The exact spot where Cole had been trapped, now unrecognizable under a blanket of ash and heat shimmer. Cole had made it. That mattered more than she let herself fully feel yet, standing there with smoke still stinging her eyes. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a name she hadn't said out loud in 6 years surfaced anyway. Dylan, the reminder that this particular kind of relief wasn't something she'd always gotten to feel. She didn't look back at it for longer than she needed to. There would be time to feel the weight of how close that had actually been later. Once everyone was accounted for, and the adrenaline finally had somewhere safe to land. Battalion Chief Marcus Teague arrived with the first Wildland engine crew 12 minutes later. Radio already crackling with a containment plan built around information that was already 15 minutes out of date. "Your fire's already jumped the West Ridge," Naomi told him before he'd finished stepping out of the truck. "It's not where your last update says it is. You need to reroute your crew's approach, or you'll be cutting line in front of a front that's already moved past where you think it is." Teague studied her for a beat. The specific look of a man deciding whether to trust a stranger's read on fire behavior over his own team's most recent intelligence. "How do you know that?" Behind him, his crew was already unloading gear based on the outdated plan. Hoses being staged in a position Naomi already knew would be wrong within minutes. "Because I watched it happen from 100 yards away 10 minutes ago," Naomi said. "And because fire in a valley this narrow, with wind like this, almost always does exactly what it just did. That's not something most civilians know how to predict." "I'm not most civilians," Naomi said. "I don't have time to explain the rest of it right now. Your crew needs to move, or they're setting up behind a fire line that's already gone." Teague looked at her for one more second, weighing a decade of training against a stranger's flat certainty, and made the call anyway. The gamble of a commander who'd learned to trust the shape of confidence over the comfort of familiar procedure. His crew rerouted. The fire, exactly as Naomi had predicted, had already crossed the position they'd originally planned to hold. Teague didn't say anything about it in the moment. There wasn't time, but he filed the exchange away. The rare piece of information that turns out to matter more than the source it came from. For the next hour, Naomi stayed close to the perimeter Teague's crew was establishing. Not analyzing fire behavior for them. That wasn't her expertise, and she knew better than to pretend otherwise in front of trained wildland firefighters. But flagging terrain and evacuation route details his team hadn't had time to survey yet. Which drainage ditches would fill with runoff if the fire triggered a flash flood warning? Where the old logging road still connected to the highway, unmarked on any current map. Small, specific pieces of ground knowledge that saved his crew time, without ever asking them to trust her over their own training. "You're not wrong about the terrain," Teague told her once, checking a route she'd flagged against his own map. "Good thing to know before we commit people to it." One of his firefighters, watching Naomi call out a drainage route from memory without once consulting a map, muttered to the man next to him, "Who is this lady?" The other firefighter just shrugged, equally unable to explain how a volunteer camp medic seemed to know this valley better than the crew that had trained on it. By 1 p.m., the last of Cedar Hollow's 300 campers had cleared the valley, evacuated to a staging area 2 miles down the highway. Smoke still rising behind them in a column visible for 50 miles. Nobody had died. 6 people were treated for smoke inhalation, 2 for minor burns, and Cole Simmons's dog had survived with nothing worse than singed whiskers. And a story he'd apparently be telling for years. Carol, the woman Naomi had walked to the truck, found her at the staging area to squeeze her hand once, wordless, before being pulled away by relatives checking her over. A rider sitting alone near the water station caught Naomi's attention on her way past, leaning heavily against his bike, waving off a friend's concern with a tired smile. insisting he just needed a minute to catch his breath. Naomi crouched beside him anyway. "He's not just tired," she said, loud enough for the friend to hear. "Look at his breathing, shallow, fast, and he's confused about how long he's been sitting here. That's delayed smoke inhalation, not exhaustion. It gets worse before it gets better if nobody catches it now." She flagged down a paramedic directly, giving a clean handoff report before the man had fully processed what was happening to him. Carbon monoxide symptoms can hide behind adrenaline for an hour before they show up properly. Get him on oxygen, and keep him for observation, not just a quick check. The paramedic didn't argue. Neither did the rider. Once his head cleared enough on high-flow oxygen to understand how close he'd come to walking away from a fire, only to lose the fight against it 3 hours later in a parking lot. The man with the chest pain, it turned out, had genuinely been having a cardiac event, not just a panic response. A fact confirmed by paramedics at the staging area, who credited the early warning with getting him into treatment fast enough to avoid serious damage. He wouldn't learn Naomi's name until days later, when Sorensen tracked her down specifically to pass along the man's thanks. It was one of the Wildland crew, helping consolidate gear left behind in the evacuation, who found the pack, Naomi's own bag, left behind in the first aid tent in the chaos, now recovered along with everything else abandoned in the rush. Inside, alongside basic medical supplies, was a faded patch stitched to the pack's inner lining, an unfamiliar insignia none of the crew recognized, and a battered certification card, years out of date, tucked into a side pocket. The crew member who found it radioed it in mostly out of habit, unidentified gear, camp medic's bag, and it was only when Teague ran the training program's name through dispatch that the response came back with enough detail to make him set down what he was doing and go find her himself. Teague found her at the staging area an hour later, pack in hand, sitting alone on the tailgate of a truck with a water bottle she hadn't finished. He set the pack down beside her without comment at first, giving her a moment before saying anything more. "Your crew did good work today," Naomi said, before he could speak. "Better than they probably realize yet." "They did," Teague agreed. "Had some help they didn't know they were getting, too." He held up the patch. "This yours?" Naomi looked at the patch for a long moment before answering. "It was. A long time ago. You taught wilderness survival," Teague said. It wasn't quite a question. "Search and rescue instruction. 6 years." Naomi took the pack back, running her thumb once over the worn edge of the patch. "I stopped teaching after a training exercise went wrong. A student didn't listen when I called for the group to turn back ahead of a storm. He went on alone, thought he knew better. Rockslide got him before we found him again. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. I still couldn't make myself stand in front of a class and tell people how to survive anything after that." Teague was quiet for a moment, turning the patch over once in his own hands before passing it back. "Everyone in this job's got something they made a call about that didn't go the way it was supposed to. Some of us just get luckier with the outcome than others. Doesn't make the ones who got unlucky any less good at the job. You just did it anyway today," Teague added. "For 300 strangers who never signed up for your class. That's different," Naomi said. "Nobody was following my rules today because they trusted an instructor. They were following them because it was the only way out of that valley, and I happened to be the one who could see it." "Maybe," Teague said. "Or maybe that's exactly what being an instructor actually looks like, once you stop needing the classroom to prove it." He stood to leave, then paused, looking back at her one more time. "For what it's worth, I'm going to write this up as a civilian assist in my official report. Your name's going to be on a piece of paper somewhere whether you want it there or not. Figured you should know before it happens instead of finding out later." "I don't need IT on paper," Naomi said. "Doesn't matter," Teague said. "Some of us need it on paper more than you do. Let's us remember. Next time we're tempted to trust our own read on a fire over someone else's, that's sometimes the outside voice is the one that's actually right." Pete Sorensen found her before she left the staging area, dust and soot still on his jacket, considerably less certain than he'd been 3 hours earlier arguing over a schedule board. I told you it wasn't a real threat, he said. I want that on the record, so you know I know exactly how wrong I was. You asked me to run a fire evacuation drill last month, Naomi said. Before any of this. I know, Sorensen said, and didn't try to make it sound like anything other than what it was. He turned his schedule board over in his hands, the same board he'd been holding 3 hours earlier. Now smudged with soot and looking considerably less important than it had that morning. I've been running this rally 9 years without a single serious incident. I think that record made me lazy about believing anything could actually go wrong on my watch. You believed the information you had, Naomi said. It was outdated information. That's a different mistake than not caring. Sorensen shook his head slowly. I had a woman standing in front of me telling me the wind had shifted. And I still checked a schedule board before I checked the sky. I've run this rally for 9 years. I'm going to be thinking about that decision for a lot longer than 9 more. 300 people are alive because you didn't accept the information I had. Naomi said, I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing. The club's putting in for a commendation through the fire department. I know you don't want it. I'm doing it anyway. I don't need a commendation. Naomi said, I know, Sorensen said. That's exactly why I'm doing it anyway. People who don't need the credit are usually the ones who most deserve it. And I'd rather get that wrong in your favor than keep getting it wrong the way I did this morning. Naomi didn't argue with him about it further. Some things she'd learned a long time ago weren't worth spending the last of her energy fighting after a day like this one. Naomi drove home 3 days later with the pack still in her passenger seat. Patch and certification card tucked back inside where they'd sat forgotten for longer than she wanted to admit. She thought about the letter still sitting unfinished in a drawer at home, 6 pages to Dylan's family that she'd never worked up the nerve to send. Written in the weeks after the review board cleared her of any wrongdoing. And did nothing at all to clear the part of her that still replayed the exact moment he'd turned away from the group. Certain he knew better. Certain the storm would hold off long enough. That kind of trust. The trust Cole had given her voice in the smoke. The trust 300 strangers had given a person with no visible authority beyond her own certainty, had cost her something once. It had also, apparently, still been worth giving to strangers on a day when it mattered enough. Dylan hadn't trusted her voice when it counted most. Cole had, and it had brought him home instead of costing him everything. Cole Simmons called her 2 weeks later, his dog apparently fully recovered. Wanted you to know Daisy's doing fine, he said. Also wanted to say thank you properly, not coughing half to death while I said it. Back there in the smoke, Cole added. You sounded like you'd done that 100 times before. It wasn't nothing, Naomi said. It just wasn't the first time I've had to talk someone through something they couldn't see the end of yet. Club's talking about asking you to run a basic wilderness safety session before next year's rally. Cole said, no pressure. Naomi didn't say yes right away. She also, for the first time in 6 years, didn't say no immediately either. She kept the patch on the dashboard of her car after that. Not hidden in a bag anymore. Not explained to anyone who asked about it. Just visible, a small, quiet fact about who she used to be. No longer something she needed to keep entirely separate from who she was now. Sometimes the hardest part of surviving your own worst day isn't recovering the skill you lost faith in, it's discovering, years later, that the skill never actually left you. It was just waiting for a day important enough to need it again.